Today, we're going to create this fully working tic-tac-toe game with just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. No libraries, no extra assets, just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Let's do it. So here, I've just got a blank VS Code editor, so let's go ahead and just create our 3 files we need. So we'll create our index.html file, we will create our script.js file, and we will create our style.css file. Now let's go ahead and start with the HTML. So we'll go ahead and create our boilerplate code, and we'll change the title to Tic-Tac-Toe. And then let's go ahead and link our styles and our CSS. So link for our styles. So we'll say style.css. And then we will link our script. So we'll say script with a source of script.js, and we will just defer that. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to create this outer div here that's going to contain both the board and the controls. So we're going to say this is a div with the class of outer, and then inside of that we're going to create the board and the controls. So we're going to say a div of board, and then we're going to create another div right beside it with the class of controls. So inside of the board class, we're just going to create 9 separate divs for each one of these individual squares here. So we're just going to create a .square div, and we're going to duplicate that 9 separate times. So 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So that should be 9 divs with the class of square. Now let's create our controls here, and we just have 2 separate buttons down here that say start game and reset game. So we'll create 2 separate buttons, one with a class of start, and then another with a class of reset. Now let's just go ahead and actually minimize that, and let's actually give the text inside of these buttons. So we'll say start game, and then we'll say reset game. And let's just go ahead and save that, and then let's just pull that up over here. So now we've just got start game and reset game. So let's go ahead and head over to our styling now and start styling this a little bit. So over here in our styling, the first thing that I want to do is I always like to select everything along with everything before and along with everything after, and I like to give it a box sizing of border box. Then I like to remove any kind of default margin or padding. So we'll set margin to 0, and we will set padding to 0. Now the next thing we need to do is we need to work on that outer div. So let's just select the class of outer. Then we're going to set the height for the whole thing. So we're going to say height is going to be 100 view height, and then the width is going to be 100 view width. That way it takes up the entire screen regardless of the screen size. So let's then say display of flex, and then let's give it a flex direction of column. That way the game board and the game controls both stack on top of one another. Next thing we need to do is we need to align the items to the center, and then we need to justify the content to space evenly. Not space around, space evenly. And that's going to allow our board up here and then our controls down here. Now the next thing we need to do is we need to set up our game board. So we're going to say board, and then we're going to give it a display of grid, because that way we can get this 3 by 3 square over here. So we're going to set that grid, and then we're going to set the grid template columns to repeat 3 times at 100 pixel width. And that's going to give us our 3 by 3, and each individual square is going to be 100 pixels. Next thing we need to do is we actually need to create the individual squares. So we need to style each individual square. So we're going to select the square, and then we need to set the height on those. So each one is going to be 100 pixels high, and the width with 100 pixels in width. Next, we just need to center everything. So we're going to set the display of flex, and we'll say justify content center, and we're going to align items to the center. Next, we need to set up the outline for our tic-tac-toe game. So if we look over here, it looks like this square, and this square both have left and right borders, and it looks like this square, and this square both have top and bottom borders. So let's select those individual squares and give those individual borders. So let's go down here, and we're going to select square, and we're going to say nth child at 2, nth child at 5, and nth child at 8. Don't forget to put your commas after the first 2. Next, we need to actually give those borders. So we're going to say border right. We're going to say it's solid 1 pixel black. And then we're also going to give a border left of solid 1 pixel black. And if we save that, it looks like we've got our borders. Now, actually, let's thicken those borders up. Let's give it a 2 pixel border. That way it's a little bit thicker and we can kind of see it a little bit better. The next thing we need to do is we need to create the cross beams. So we're going to select the square at nth child of 4, 5, and 6. And again, don't forget your commas after the first 2. And then we're going to set a border top of solid 2 pixels black. Then we're going to set a border bottom of solid 2 pixels black. And that should be our tic-tac-toe board. Now the next thing we need to do is we need to create our X's and our O's. And we could easily use characters X and O for that, but that's going to look a little bit different depending on the browser that you're using. So let's instead create our own X's and O's, but we actually need to create 2 of each one of them. Because if we take a look over here, we have a hover X, and then we also have an X whenever you click on one. And these are both basically identical. The only difference is the color. So let's just go ahead and create 2 of them over here. We'll start with the X class. So we'll just go ahead and select the X class, and we'll select the X hover class. And like I said, these are both going to be basically identical, so we will change what we need to change whenever we get to that point. But first, we need to give this a position of relative. Next, we need to give this a height of 100 pixels and a width of 100 pixels. And this is going to be the surrounding box. This is going to be the whole box that fills this, and then we will style the individual X itself here in just a second. So we also need to give this a display of flex. We need to give it a flex direction of column. And then we need to justify the content to the center. And that is going to be our outer surrounding box for each of the individual X classes. Now let's actually add one of these X classes to this square here so that we can actually see each one of them as we style it. So if we save that, we don't see anything just yet, but we will here shortly. Next, we need to select the X before, the X after. Then we need to select the X hover before and the X hover after. And then we need to give this a little bit of styling here. So we're going to give this a position of absolute. We're going to give it no content. So we're going to give it content with an empty string. Then we're going to set the width to 100%. Then we're going to set the height of 8 pixels. Then we're going to give it a border radius of 10 pixels. And we're going to set the background color to black. Now, I did a lot of things here, so let's actually go through each one of them, what we actually did. And you can actually see I've got some weird thing popping up over here. I'll explain that here in just a second. So, we're selecting the before and the after. So, this is going to create 2 of them, basically. So, we're giving it a position of absolute, so we're absolutely positioning it inside of this square. We're not going to give it any content, but we need to add the content there. We're going to give it a width of 100% so it spans the entire width of the individual square here. Then we're going to give it a height of 8 pixels, and this height is going to be this height right here for this bar right here. Then we're going to give it the border radius so it has a little bit of a rounded corner on it. And the background color is going to be the background for this black piece right here. And technically there's actually 2 of them right there stacked on top of one another. Now this is where everything is going to start coming together. So we need to create the X itself now. So we're actually going to select the X before, and we're going to select the X hover before, and we're going to give this a transform of rotate, and we're going to rotate this 45 degrees. And if you're on Mozilla or WebKit browsers, we also need to add the Moz transform, and then we need to do the exact same thing, rotate 45 degrees. And for WebKit, we're going to say WebKit transform, and we're going to rotate 45 degrees. Next, we need to basically do the exact same thing. So we're going to just go ahead and copy and paste this down. And we're going to do the exact same thing for the after. So we're going to change these befores to afters. And then we're going to do a negative in front of each one of these 45 degrees. So what this is actually going to do is one of this is going to be the before line and is going to rotate it 45 degrees one way. Then this is going to define that the after line, the second line that we created, is going to rotate negative 45 degrees. So we'll have one at 45 and one at negative 45, which should give us our X there, and it does. Now, the only thing left we need to do with the X is we actually need to change the color for the hover class. So let's just select the X hover, and we're going to select the before, and we're going to select the X hover after. That way it styles both lines. Then we're going to set the background color to RGB 125, 125, 125. And let's just actually go ahead and add that X hover class to one of our squares, so we can see now that we've got the X class and the X hover class. So whenever we hover, we'll get this one, and then whenever we click on one, we will get this one. Next, we actually need to work on the O class. So let's actually just go ahead and replace this X with the O, and we will select the O hover as well. Now, if we save, we get absolutely nothing again. So let's go ahead and start with our O class now. Now, to create our O class, we're just going to have one smaller O inside of one bigger O. So let's just go ahead and start by selecting the O class, and then we're also going to select the O hover class, and we're going to give it a position of relative. We're going to add the height of 100 pixels and the width of 100 pixels. Then we're just going to center everything. So we're going to say display of flex, justify content center, and align items center. Next, we need to create the bigger O, so we're going to say O before, and we're going to select the O hover before. Then we're going to give it a position of absolute. Content, we're going to give it an empty string again. We're going to give it a background color of black. Then we're going to give it a height and a width of 90%. And then finally, we're just going to give it a border radius of 50%. And if we save that, we've got two black O's so far that are popping up. Next, we need to work on the center part to give it that illusion of being an O. So the next thing we need to do is we need to select the O after, and we need to select the O hover after. Then we're also going to give this a position of absolute. We're going to also give it content of an empty string. And then we're basically going to do the exact same thing. So we're going to give it a height and a width of 75%. We're going to give it some border radius of 50%. And we're going to give this one a background color of white. So now we've got that O class that is just a circle that just looks like it has the border around it. Now the only thing left that we have to do with this class is we actually need to add the hover class. So we're going to select the O hover, and we're going to select the before. This way it will overwrite the original color with the background of black for that. And we'll set the background color to that RGB 125, 125, 125. Now we've got that lighter color for the hover, and we've got that darker color for when we actually click it. So now we just have a few cleanup things that we have to do. So first thing we need to do is we need to create a disabled class. And this class is going to remove pointer events. So we're going to set pointer events to none. The next thing we need to do is we need to add the hover class for the square. That way we get a pointer whenever we hover over each one of these squares. So we're going to set the square hover pseudo selector, and then we're going to say cursor pointer. So that should give us a pointer whenever we hover over any one of these squares here. And the last class is going to be a display of none class. That way we can show and hide different things as we need it. So we're going to say d-none is my favorite way to do this. And we're going to say display of none. And that is it for the basics for the board itself. We will come back to the CSS here shortly, but let's go ahead and do a couple things over here. Let's actually remove these classes here, save that, and now we can finally start writing some JavaScript. So over here in the JavaScript, the first thing that we need to do is we need to select all of those squares. So let's just go ahead and say squares. We'll say const squares is equal to document.querySelector all, and we'll select all of those squares with the square class on it. The next thing that we need to do is we need to create a function to start the game. So we'll say function, and we're going to say start. And then we're just going to go ahead and call that start function. Now later on we will change this so that we add an event listener to the start game button. But for now, let's just go ahead and call that function. Next thing we need to do is we actually need to add a few event listeners to each one of those squares. Specifically, an event listener for whenever we mouse over one of the squares, another event listener whenever we leave the square so we can hide that hover class, and then a third one so that it can register whenever we click on one of those squares to make our selection. So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to go ahead and loop over each one of those squares by using squares.forEach. Then we'll add our callback function, taking in each one of those individual squares. So we'll say square. And then for each square, we're going to add an event listener, 3 separate event listeners. So we'll say square.addEventListener, and then we'll first listen for the mouse over event, which will give us the hover class whenever we mouse over each one of these squares. And then we'll just point to a function. We haven't actually created it yet, but we'll just go ahead and point to it for now. We'll say show hover. And then we need to add another 2 event listeners. This event listener is going to be the mouse out event, and then we will say hide hover, and then the last event listener is going to be the click event listener, and this is going to be the handle square selection event. And this is going to be the event listener whenever we click on each one of these squares. So the mouse over is going to show the hover class whenever we hover over one. The mouse out is whenever we leave the square and we are no longer hovering over one. It's going to hide that hover class. Then the last one is going to be whenever we click on one, it's going to handle that click and it's going to add everything to the page that we need. Now the next thing that we need to do is we need to create the turn counter, and the way this is going to work is it's just going to be a Boolean value, and by default whenever the game starts we'll automatically set it to X's turn, and then we can swap back and forth until the game is over. So we first need to just define it in the global scope. So we'll say let X turn, and we're just going to define it to undefined at the very beginning. That way whenever we start we can actually set X turn equal to X. So we can say X turn inside of the start function. We'll set that equal to true. So that way we could say it is X's turn whenever we immediately start the game. Now the next thing we need to do is we actually need to create these 2 functions here. We're going to create the show and hide hover classes. So we're going to say function show hover, and then we're also going to create the function hide hover. And for each one of these functions, we need to pass in the event. So I'm just going to pass in the event object here. So the next thing we need to do is we need to check to see if it is X's turn. So if X turn is true, then we want to show the X hover. So we're going to say event.target.classlist.add. And on that class list, we're going to add the X hover class. So that way, whenever it is X's turn and we're hovering over one of these squares, it's going to add that X hover class. Otherwise, if it's not X's turn, that must mean it's O's turn. So then otherwise, we're going to say that it's going to be e.target.classlist.add, and we're going to add the O hover class. So if we save that, we should get the X that is hovering whenever we hover over one of these squares. Now we also need to be able to hide it. So we're basically going to do the exact same thing, but the opposite way for the hide hover class. So we're going to check to see if it is currently X's turn. Then we're going to say e.target.classlist.remove, and we're going to remove the X hover class. Else, then it must be O's turn. We're going to say e.target.classlist.remove. We're going to remove the O hover class. Now the next thing that we need to do is we need to create that function to handle the click. So let's just go ahead and say function handle square selection, and we're just going to take in the event object for this as well. Now we need to do a few separate things in here. The first thing we need to do is we need to get the current turn. Then we need to add the mark to the screen. So we need to add the X or the O class to the screen wherever it was selected. Then we need to check to see if adding that selection caused a win or a draw, and if neither of those are true, then we need to swap the turns. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to say const current square is equal to e.target. And then we need to say let current turn. And this will make sense here in just a second. So next we need to check to see if X turn, so if it is X's turn, then we're going to set the current turn equal to that X class. Otherwise, if it is not X's turn, that must mean that it's O's turn, then we're going to set the current turn equal to that O class. Now we need to add a function to add the mark. So we're going to say add mark, and then we're going to pass in the current turn and the current square. So we're going to pass in the current turn and the current square. Next thing we need to do is we need to check if that caused a win. So we're going to say if, and then we're going to say check if when. So we're going to create a function called check if when, and this is going to return true if it is a win, and it's going to return false if it is not a win. So inside of here, then we're going to call an end function, and actually we're going to return the end function, which is going to cause an end of game. Then if that's not true, so if this is not true here, then we're going to also check to see if, then we're going to create another function, check for draw. And if that is true, then we're going to also return end. And if neither of those are true, we're just going to swap turns. And we'll create that function as well. So let's just go ahead and create some of these functions here, and it'll start to kind of make sense how this stuff works. So the first function, we'll just go ahead and create the add mark function. And we'll say function add mark. And the mark is going to take in the current turn and the current square. So whenever we add the mark, what we want to do is we want to remove any classes that are hover classes. So we want to remove all of the hover classes. So we'll say current square, which is, again, remember the current square is the event target that we clicked on. So the current square dot class list dot remove, and we are going to remove both the X hover class and we're going to remove the O hover class. Now, whenever we add the square, we want to add a disabled class. So we want to disable that so that we can't click on that again. And remember, the disabled class, if you remember over here, we are removing pointer events completely. So we cannot click on that square once we add that disabled class. So we could say current square dot class list dot add, and we'll add disabled. And then the last thing that we need to do is we actually need to add the mark. So the current turn that clicked on the square. So if it's X's turn, then we need to add the X. And then if it's O's turn, then we need to add the O. So we can say current square dot class list dot add. and we can actually add the current turn. That way, whenever we create current turn up here and then we pass it in right here, it will be received here and it will add whichever class is currently active. Now, the next thing we need to do is we need to check to see if that mark that we just added is going to cause a when. So let's create the function check if when. And inside of this function, we're just going to take in the current turn. So we know whose turn it is and who is going to win if there is a win. Now, before we actually create this function, we actually need to know what actually causes a win. So we need to create an array. So let's go ahead and go up here, and we're going to create an array constant called possible wins. And we're going to create an array with a bunch of different arrays inside of it. And we're just going to loop through these possible wins. And if any one of them matches every single number inside of it, then we're going to know that we won. So the possible wins, if we take a look at it, are starting at index 0 and ending at index 8. So we can do 0, 1, and 2. So we'll add 0, 1, and 2 to our possible wins array. Then we could possibly win at 0, 3, and 6. So we can add 0, 3, and 6 to our possible wins array. Then on the diagonal, we could possibly win at 0, 4, and 8. So we could say 0, 4, and 8 to our possible wins array. Now we could also win right here, right here, right here, right here, and this diagonal here as well. So we could win possibly at 1, 4, and 7. So it'd be 1, 4, and 7 right here. And then it would be 2, 5, and 8. So we could add 2, 5, and 8 to our possible wins array. Then we need to check the horizontal here. So we could say 3, 4, and 5 for this one right here. Then we could check to see 6, 7, and 8, and we need to check the diagonal here, so we could say 2, 4, and 6. So now I think we've got all of our possible wins in here, so let's go ahead and head back down to our check if win function. Now the way this is going to work, it's going to look a little odd, but bear with me here for a second. So whenever we loop through the possible wins, we're going to check to see if any of them match up with every single one of the current turn's values. So let's say we have X here, 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 and here. So if we have X's in all four of these, and this was the last turn, so we're checking to see if there's a win. So it's going to loop through that possible wins array, and it's going to check to see if we have 0, 1, and 2 in any of those ones in there. And it's going to check to see if every single one of those are included in that array. So if we do have 0, 1, and 2 inside of one of those possible wins arrays, then we're going to know that that's going to be a win. So let me write it out. It might make a little bit more sense. So we're going to say return, and we're going to return the possible wins dot sum. So we're going to check sum of the possible wins, and we're going to say the combination. And then inside of this, we're actually going to return combination dot every. So if every single value inside of that combination, the current combination of the current state of whichever turn we're on, if every single one of those matches one of those ones inside of the possible wins array, then we're going to know that we won. So inside of here, we're actually going to pass in the index, and we're just going to return squares at index I dot class list dot contains, and we're going to check if it contains the current term. So the way that this is going to work is it's going to loop through all of the possible wins, and it's going to get all of the combinations inside of those possible wins, so each individual one of these. Now, whenever it goes through each one of those, it's going to check to see if every single value in each one of those matches up with the current values that contains the current terms. So if X is at 0, 1, and 2, and this was the last one, so it's going to check to see if 0, 1, and 2 are contained inside of that possible wins array. Now the next thing that we need to do is we need to check to see if we have a draw. So if we got past the check if win function and we didn't have a win, now we need to check to see if every single square square is full and we have a draw. So let's create that function check for draw, and we're going to get the current state of the board. So we're going to say const current state, and we're going to say document dot query selector all, and we're just going to select all of those squares again to get the current state of the board. Then we're just going to return current state dot every, and actually current state is not actually an array, it's actually a node list. So we need to convert that to an array, and the easiest way to do that, because it is an array-like structure, is we can just create an in-place array and spread that current state into a new array. So that way we have access to the every method. Now, because the every method is not available on a node list, but it is available on an array. So we're going to check to see if every single square inside of the current state has either an X value or an O value. And if it does, if it's true that every value or every square has a value, then we're going to return that it is true that we have a draw. So we're going to take in the current square, and we're going to return square.classList.contains, and we're going to check to see if it contains the X, or if it contains, so square.classList.contains the O class. So it's going to return true if every single square inside of our board has either an X class or an O class. And if every single square inside of the board has at least one of those classes, and we got past the check for win, then we know that it was a draw and we can end the game. Now, the next thing that we need to do is we need to create the swap turn function, and this is probably going to be one of the easiest functions we write in this whole thing. So we're going to say function swap turn, and we're just going to say xTurn is equal to not xTurn. And that's it. That's how we swap our turns. But now that we have the swap turn function implemented, we pretty much have a nearly working game. It's not complete just yet, but we're nearly there. And it looks like it just broke because I probably just called the end function, which we don't have. So let's go ahead and implement that end function. So we're going to say function end, and we're going to take in the current winner, and we're going to take in the value if it is a draw or not. So we're going to say is draw. So for now, we're just going to say if winner. So we're going to check to see if we have a winner that was passed in. And then we're also going to check to see if it is a draw. So either one of these two will be true. So we actually need to, up here, pass in, if it is a win, we need to pass in the current turn. And for the second one is draw, we actually need to pass in false. And if it is a draw, we need to pass in to the end function null for no winner at all, and we need to pass in true. So if we do have a winner, we're going to pass in the winner as the current turn, which, as you remember up here, is either X or O, whichever one clicked on the square last. So we'll pass in the current winner, and we will pass in the is a draw as false. And if it is a draw, we're going to pass in null for we don't have a winner, and true as for it is a draw. Now we need to create a function to reset our board. So right here, we're actually going to hold off on this for just a few minutes because we actually need to add some more HTML and CSS to this. So let's go ahead and create our reset board function. So we're going to say function reset board, and we're basically just going to do the exact same thing, but in the reverse that we did up here whenever we called start game. So I'm actually just going to go ahead and copy that, and I'll go ahead and paste that down here. Now, like I said, we're going to do the exact same thing, but instead of adding the event listeners, we're going to remove the event listeners. So we'll remove the 3 event listeners. And then we also need to remove all of the X and O classes. So for each square, we're going to say square.classList.remove, and we're just going to remove the X, and we're going to remove the O classes from every single one of them. Now we also need to call that function whenever we end the game, so that way the board is completely reset. So we're going to call reset board right here. Now if we actually take a look over here at our working version, whenever we end the game, we actually get this modal that pops up and says whoever's current turn that just won, and then we get a button that allows us to play again, and then we can start the game again. So we kind of need to implement that modal. So let's go ahead and head back over to the CSS, and right up here above the outer div here, we're going to create our modal. So we're going to say .modal wrapper, and this is going to be the wrapper for our modal, and then we're going to create the modal itself. So we're going to say modal, and then inside of that we're going to have 3 separate parts. So if we take a look at it here, we have the header, then we have the content here, and then we have the button. So let's create the header, and this is going to be the modal header, and then we are going to create the modal body, which is this portion right here, and then we need to create the modal controls, which is going to be this button right here. And let's actually add that button here. So we'll say button with a class of reset, and inside of that we're going to say play again, and we'll go ahead and save that. Now let's go ahead and head over to the CSS, and let's actually go ahead and style this. So I'll just head back up to the top because that's where our modal is supposed to be at, and we will go ahead and style our modal. So I'm going to grab the modal wrapper, and I'm going to set on the modal wrapper, I'm going to say the height is going to be 100 view height, and the width is going to be 100 view width. Then I'm going to set a background color on this. So we're going to say background color, which is this background right here. And this is going to be an RGBA, and it's going to be a 92, 92, 92 with a 0.5 transparency. So it's going to be half transparent. So now that we have this modal here, we see the button that says play again, and we have that background that is partially transparent. Now we need to absolutely position that. So we're going to say position is going to be absolute, and then we just need to center it. So we're going to say display is flex. We're going to align items center, and we're just going to justify content to the center. Now we need to style the modal itself. So let's go ahead and select the dot modal, and we're going to set a height of 30%, a width of 50%. That way it's 30% of the whole screen's height and 50% of the whole screen's width. We're going to set a white background color, and then we're going to give it a small border radius of 10 pixels. Now we need to style the modal body and the modal header. So let's go ahead and start with the modal header class. And the modal header class is going to be 100% in width. So we're going to say width is going to be 100%. So that way it spans the entire width of the modal itself. Then we're going to add this bottom border here. So we're going to say border bottom, and we're going to say it's solid 1 pixel black. Then we're going to set the font size so it's a little bit bigger. So we're going to say font size is going to be 3 rem, and then we're going to set the text align to center. That way it's centered here. And if we check it out now, it looks like we kind of have something to go off of here. Now the last thing that we need to do is we need to style the modal body. Actually, not the last thing, the next to last thing. We actually need to style the buttons as well. So we need to select the modal body, and we're going to set the width to 100%. We're going to give it a slightly bigger font size. So let's say font size is 3.5 rem. We're going to text align center again. And then we're going to add some padding of 15 pixels to the top and bottom and nothing to the left and right. Now we're actually going to style both this button and these 2 buttons down here exactly the same. So let's just go ahead and add a generic button. And we're going to set the height of 40 pixels, the width of 100 pixels. We're going to set the background color to transparent. We're going to give it a border of solid 1 pixel black. we're going to remove the outline. We're going to set padding to 5 pixels all the way around, and we're going to set 5 pixels of margin all the way around as well. And that's our generic button. Now, whenever we hover on the button, we also need to do a couple of things here. So we're going to say button hover, and we're going to set the background color to black. So whenever we hover it, it's going to be changed to the background color to black. We're going to say the color is going to be white, so the text color is going to be white. So whenever we hover over it, the background and the text color are basically going to invert. And the last thing we need to do is we need to set the cursor to pointer. That way we get that pointer whenever we hover over it. And then we also need to add a disabled button class. So whenever a button is disabled, like over here, whenever we have this disabled button here, we can actually disable that button before we start the game. So let's go ahead and head back over here, and we'll select the button pseudo selector disabled, and we're going to set the opacity to 0.5, and then we're going to set pointer events to none, so that way we can't click on the button whatsoever if it is disabled. Now, the only thing we have left to do is this modal button specifically. We just want to center it. So we're going to select the modal controls class, and we're going to set display to flex. We're going to align items to the center, and we're going to justify content to the center. And that centers our button. So now we can dynamically add, if we have a winner, that it's a winner, or if we have a draw, then it's a draw. And if we do have a winner, we can dynamically add as well which turn is the current winner, so who actually won. So let's go ahead and head over to the JavaScript, and then up here in the global scope, we're actually going to create a couple more constants. So we're going to say const modal, and we're going to set that equal to document.querySelector, and we're actually just going to select that modal wrapper. So we select the whole thing as the modal, and then we need to also select the modal header. We'll set that equal to document.querySelector, and we're going to select the modal header class, and we also need to select the modal body. So we're going to say const modal body is equal to document.querySelector, and we are going to select that modal body class. Now down here in the when function, we're actually going to set the modal.classlist.toggle, and we're going to toggle the d-none class. That way we can toggle whether this is shown or hidden. Now inside of the if it is a winner function, or the if statement, so if it is a winner, we're going to select that modal header, and we're going to say .text content. We're going to set that equal to winner. And then the body, we're going to say the modal body .text content is equal to the string template literal with the winner. So the winner will be passed in as either X or O. And then we're going to put an apostrophe S, so we can say X is 1 or O's 1. And we could say when, just like that. Now, if it is a draw, we are going to change this content based on that. So we could say modal header dot text content is going to be equal to draw, and the modal content, or the modal body dot text content, is going to be set equal to ended in a draw. And that's our end game function. So if we save that, we actually need to go back here, and we need to add the d-none class here, so that way it's automatically by default hidden. And if we save that, we should get this back here. So now let's try and play a game. So if we XOXOX, and once the X's win, we're going to get winner X's win. So now we're just about done. We just need to make these buttons work, and we need to do a little bit of extra cleanup. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to create one more function, and this is going to be the reset game function. And before we go any further with that, I want to select all of these buttons along with the board itself. So we're going to say reset buttons, and I need to create a constant. We're going to set that equal to document.querySelectorAll, and we're going to select all of the ones that have the class of reset. And then we need to select the start game button. So we're going to say start button. We're going to set that equal to document.querySelector, and we're going to select the start button. And the last thing we need to do is we need to create a constant selecting the board. And we'll select that document.querySelector, and we'll select the class of board. And that should be all the constants that we need to select. Now let's head back down here and do our reset game function. So inside of our reset game function, we're first going to reset the board. So we're going to call the reset board function. Then we're going to set that modal.classList, and then we're going to add the d-none class, and I toggled it up here, so we're just going to actually toggle. Then by default, whenever we start a game, the board is completely disabled until you click the start game button down here. So let's actually go ahead and do that. We'll say board.classList.add, and we'll add that disabled class. Then whenever we're restarting the game, we want to set all of the restart buttons to disabled. So we want to disable all of those buttons. So we're going to say reset buttons dot for each, and we're going to set button. We're going to say button dot disabled is equal to true. And then whenever we're resetting the game, we want to completely remove the disabled class from all of the squares. So we're going to say squares dot for each, and we're going to say square. And for each square, we want to remove the disabled class list. So we'll say square dot class list dot remove, and we're going to remove the disabled class. So now whenever we go up here to the start game function, we actually need to undisable those buttons. So we're going to say restart buttons or reset buttons dot for each, and we're going to say for each button we want to remove the disabled class. So we're going to say button dot disabled is equal to false. And then we also want to add an event listener to each one of those functions that's going to point to the reset game function. So that way, whenever we click on it, it's going to completely reset the game. Then that's only whenever we start the game. So we're going to say button.add event listener. And on the click, we want to point to the reset game function. And then right before we add the event listeners to the squares, we want to select the board and remove the disabled class so we can actually play the game. And that is it for the JavaScript, I think. I don't think we have anything else. I think we need to add the disabled class by default to the board, and I lied. We actually have one more thing inside the JavaScript. We need to make this button work. So we're going to say start button dot add event listener, and on the click, we want to point to start. So now that whenever we click on this start game button, it's going to start the game. And the last thing I think we need to do is on the reset buttons, we need to set disabled, and on this button up here as well. And if we save that, that should be our tic-tac-toe game. So let's go ahead and start the game. We start as X, and then we can play as O, and we can play this here. And it looks like the X's win. And whenever we get that modal, it looks like our button does work, and it looks like it completely resets our game for us. Pause. Sorry for the interruption, but as I was just editing this video, I noticed we actually have a small bug in our code. So let's check it out. So let's say that we are playing a game and we don't finish it and we actually reset the game. What in the world? Exactly. So to fix this is actually very easy. I don't know why I changed this back whenever I was creating this the first time, but this actually needs to be add in here in the reset game function. The modal.classlist.toggle needs to be changed to add. That way it doesn't automatically pop the modal whenever we reset the game in the middle of a game. So now if we play our game and we happen to reset the game in the middle of the game, our modal is not going to pop anymore. Just want to clear that up just so we don't have any confusion. My bad. Sorry for the interruption. Now back to Pask Island. And that is a fully working Tic-Tac-Toe game. Now if you did like the video, make sure you slap a like on it. Check out the full playlist if you want to learn full stack web development. Link is right next to me. Make sure you subscribe and I will see you in the next one.